Somewhere in your kitchen right now, there is a small hum you probably don't even notice anymore. It's the sound of a machine working quietly in the corner, keeping your milk from turning, your leftovers from rotting, your medicine from spoiling. But think about the last time that hum stopped. Think about opening the fridge on a hot afternoon after a power outage and catching that smell, the one that tells you everything inside is already gone. Think about standing there holding a bag of meat you bought 2 days ago, doing the math in your head, wondering if it's still safe, wondering how much money just went into the trash. That small panic, that quiet dread of losing food you worked to buy, is something almost every family on earth has felt at least once. Now imagine living your entire life like that. Imagine never trusting that your food would still be good tomorrow. Imagine planning every single meal around the fear of spoilage, every single day, for your whole life, generation after generation. That was simply normal for almost all of human history. And the way out of that fear did not come from a giant corporation or a government program. It came from one man in one small city, trying to solve one small, personal, almost embarrassing problem in a single year that changed the shape of daily life forever. His name was Fred W. Wolf, an engineer living in Fort Wayne, Indiana in the year 1913. He was not trying to reinvent civilization. He was not thinking about global food systems or population growth or international trade. He was thinking, quite simply, about ice. Like almost every household in America at the time, Wolf relied on an icebox, a wooden cabinet lined with tin or zinc that held a large block of ice on one side to keep food cool on the other. Every few days, a man known as the Iceman would arrive with a horse-drawn cart, carrying heavy blocks cut from frozen lakes and rivers months earlier, hauling them up staircases with metal tongs, dripping water across kitchen floors. It was expensive, it was messy, it depended on someone else's schedule, and in the middle of summer, it often simply was not enough. Fred Wolf, tired of depending on delivery schedules and melting ice, began experimenting with a way to cool a cabinet using electricity instead. He built a compact mechanical unit that could sit on top of an icebox, using a small motor and refrigerant gas to chill the air inside without needing a single block of ice ever again. He called it the domestic electric refrigerator, and it is considered the first practical, self-contained home refrigeration unit ever sold to ordinary families. It was clunky, it was loud, it was far from perfect, and almost nobody at the time understood that this strange metal box sitting quietly on top of a wooden cabinet in Fort Wayne, Indiana, would eventually rearrange the entire architecture of human civilization. To understand how enormous this moment truly was, you first have to understand how the world worked before it. Before mechanical refrigeration became common in ordinary homes, food preservation was one of the most demanding, time-consuming, and dangerous parts of daily life. Families spent entire seasons preparing for the ones that followed. In autumn, meat was salted, smoked, or packed in barrels of brine because there was simply no other way to keep it edible through the winter. Root cellars were dug beneath houses or barns, small underground rooms lined with dirt walls where the temperature stayed cool and stable enough to store potatoes, carrots, onions, apples, and cabbages for months at a time. Milk soured within hours if it was not consumed almost immediately, which meant fresh milk had to be bought or milked daily, often more than once. Meat that was not properly preserved could spoil within a single day in warm weather, and eating spoiled meat was one of the most common causes of serious illness and death, especially among children. Fish caught in the morning had to be sold, cooked and eaten before nightfall or thrown away entirely. In cities, ice was delivered by cart from companies that had built an entire industry around cutting massive blocks from frozen lakes in winter, storing them in insulated warehouses packed in sawdust, and transporting them across entire countries and even oceans throughout the year. A wealthy family in New Orleans might pay a small fortune for ice that had been cut from a lake in Massachusetts months earlier, shipped by boat, and stored underground the entire journey. This was the reality Frederick Tudor, known as the Ice King of Boston, had built decades earlier when he began shipping New England ice to the Caribbean and even to India, proving that something as simple as frozen water could become a global commodity worth immense sums of money. But even with that entire industry in place, ice remained a luxury for the wealthy and a constant, exhausting logistical burden for everyone else. Meals were planned around what was in season, what could be preserved, and what would not go to waste before it was consumed. Shopping happened almost daily, not weekly, because there was simply nowhere safe to keep food for very long. Women, who were overwhelmingly responsible for household food management at the time, spent hours every single day simply managing the survival of what was already in the house. Fred Wolf's small invention in 1913 did not immediately change any of this. His original Domeray unit, as it came to be known, was expensive, mechanically unreliable, and produced in small numbers. But it planted an idea that other engineers and companies immediately understood the value of. Within just a few years, major companies began racing to build their own versions of home refrigeration. General Electric introduced the Monitor top refrigerator in the 1920s, a machine so recognizable by its circular compressor unit on top that it became a design icon of the era. Kelvinator, Frigidaire, and other brands entered the market almost immediately, competing fiercely to make refrigeration cheaper, quieter, and more reliable. And this is where the first wave of impact truly began, spreading first through the industries closest to the invention itself. The ice delivery industry, which had employed hundreds of thousands of workers across entire countries, from ice cutters on frozen lakes to delivery drivers in every city, began a slow but unstoppable decline that would take decades to fully unfold. Entire seasonal economies built around cutting and storing natural ice simply stopped making sense once households could produce their own cold. Appliance manufacturing exploded into a massive new industry almost overnight, creating factories, supply chains, and entire cities that grew around the production of refrigerators, compressors, and related electrical components. Electric utility companies, which had been struggling in many places to convince households that electricity was worth paying for beyond simple lighting, suddenly had a powerful new reason for families to wire their homes and pay a monthly bill. Because now electricity meant not just light, but safety for your food. By the way, if stories like this one, about small decisions that quietly reshaped the entire world, are the kind of thing that keeps your brain hooked long after the video ends, this channel is genuinely built for people like you. I try to dig up these overlooked turning points, the ones history classes skip past, and lay them out in a way that actually makes sense of how we got the modern world we live in today. If that sounds like your kind of rabbit hole, subscribing means you will never miss the next one. And honestly, it helps this little project keep growing so I can keep spending the hours digging through old patents, old newspapers, and forgotten biographies to bring these stories to you. No pressure at all, just know that if you stick around, there is a lot more where this came from. As refrigerators became more affordable through the 1930s, and especially after the economic recovery following the Great Depression, the second wave of impact began. And this one reached far beyond factories and utility companies, straight into the daily rhythm of ordinary life. The most immediate and dramatic change was in how families shopped and ate. For the first time in human history, an average household could buy meat, dairy, and produce that would still be safe to eat several days later, sometimes even a week or more. This meant families no longer needed to shop every single day. Weekly grocery shopping, something almost every modern family takes completely for granted, only became a widespread possibility once refrigeration made it safe to store perishable food at home for extended periods. This single shift rearranged how cities were built. Small neighborhood shops that had relied on constant daily foot traffic because customers needed fresh bread, fresh milk, and fresh meat every single day began to lose ground to larger stores where people could buy in bulk and store food for longer. This directly enabled the rise of the modern supermarket, an entirely new kind of retail experience built around the assumption that customers had refrigeration waiting for them at home. Clarence Saunders had already pioneered the self-service grocery store concept with Piggly Wiggly in Memphis, Tennessee in 1916, but it was the widespread adoption of home refrigeration in the following decades that truly allowed the supermarket model to explode across the country, because customers finally had somewhere safe to put everything they bought. The impact on women's daily labor was equally profound, even if it received far less historical attention. Household food management had traditionally consumed an enormous portion of a woman's day, from daily trips to buy perishable food, to constant monitoring of what needed to be eaten before it spoiled, to time-consuming preservation tasks like canning, salting, and smoking that had to be repeated constantly throughout the year. Refrigeration did not eliminate domestic labor, but it fundamentally restructured it, freeing up hours that had previously been consumed entirely by the logistics of keeping food edible. Some historians argue this shift, alongside other household technologies of the era like washing machines, quietly contributed to changing expectations about women's time and eventually to greater participation of women in paid labor outside the home. Since the sheer physical burden of managing perishable food no longer demanded so many hours of every single day. Refrigeration also transformed diets in ways that seem almost invisible today because we simply assume them as normal. Fresh milk, once something that had to be delivered daily or purchased that same morning, became something families could keep safely for a week. Fresh vegetables and fruits that were once strictly seasonal, available only during their natural growing months in a specific region, could now be purchased in larger quantities and stored longer, changing what an average dinner table looked like throughout the year. Meat consumption patterns shifted as well, since families no longer needed to consume an entire cut of meat within a day or two of purchase, allowing for larger cuts to be bought less frequently and portioned out over several meals. Public health also improved measurably, since foodborne illness from spoiled meat, dairy, and other perishables had been one of the leading causes of sickness, particularly among infants and young children throughout the era before refrigeration became common. Historians studying infant mortality rates in the early 20th century have pointed to safer milk storage made possible by home refrigeration as one of several important factors contributing to declining child mortality during this period. As refrigeration spread from wealthy households to the middle class and eventually to nearly every home across industrialized nations by the middle of the 20th century, the third wave of impact began to reshape entire economic and political structures, not just individual households. Agriculture itself was transformed at a fundamental level. Farmers who had previously needed to sell their entire harvest quickly before it spoiled or invest heavily in expensive and limited preservation methods could now rely on an entire cold chain, meaning a continuous system of refrigerated storage and transportation stretching from farm to warehouse to truck to store to home. This cold chain, built on the same basic principle Fred Wolf had experimented with in his small Fort Wayne workshop decades earlier, allowed food to travel much farther distances without spoiling. Refrigerated railway cars and later refrigerated trucks meant that produce grown in California could reach dinner tables in New York while still fresh. Meatpacking, dairy and produce industries scaled up dramatically, consolidating into larger operations because refrigeration made distant, large-scale distribution economically viable in ways it had never been before. This consolidation had enormous political consequences as well, shifting economic power toward regions with ideal growing conditions and away from smaller, local producers who could no longer compete on price or availability once refrigerated transport made distant. Mass-produced food just as accessible and often cheaper than what was grown nearby. Refrigeration also played a quiet but significant role in reshaping international trade and even geopolitics. Countries with strong agricultural sectors, such as Argentina, Australia, and New Zealand, built massive export economies around refrigerated meat shipments to Europe. something that would have been physically impossible without mechanical cooling technology capable of keeping meat frozen or chilled across weeks-long ocean voyages. Entire national economies restructured themselves around the ability to export perishable goods across oceans, something unthinkable in the era of natural ice alone. During both World Wars, refrigeration technology also became strategically important, allowing militaries to preserve food supplies for troops stationed far from home. And after World War II, the widespread rollout of home refrigerators became one of the visible symbols of rising prosperity in the post-war United States and later in Europe and Japan, closely tied to broader narratives about modern living standards, economic growth, and even ideological competition during the Cold War, when the ability of ordinary citizens to afford appliances like refrigerators was sometimes explicitly used as propaganda, comparing the standard of living in capitalist versus communist countries. By the second half of the 20th century, the fourth and largest wave of impact had become undeniable, stretching across the entire globe and touching nearly every human being on the planet, whether they realized it or not. Refrigeration became one of the invisible pillars supporting modern civilization itself. The global food system as it exists today, capable of feeding billions of people across continents, depends entirely on an unbroken cold chain stretching from farms and fishing boats to processing plants, warehouses, shipping containers, trucks, grocery stores, and finally home refrigerators. Without this system, the modern scale of cities, many of which house tens of millions of people who could never realistically grow or hunt their own food locally, would simply not be possible. Urbanization itself, one of the defining transformations of the last century, was quietly enabled in part by the ability to safely store and transport food across vast distances, allowing massive concentrations of people to live far from where their food was actually produced. Public health improvements tied to safe food storage, vaccine refrigeration, and medical cold chains have saved countless lives around the world, since many vaccines and medications require strict temperature control from the moment they are manufactured until the moment they are administered, a requirement that depends entirely on refrigeration technology, built upon the same basic principles Fred Wolf experimented with in 1913. And yet, in a twist that feels almost poetic given how this story began, the very technology that solved one of humanity's oldest and most persistent problems eventually created problems nobody could have anticipated. The refrigerants used in early and mid-century refrigeration systems, particularly a class of chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons, were discovered decades later to be steadily destroying the ozone layer, the protective atmospheric shield that blocks harmful ultraviolet radiation from reaching the Earth's surface. This discovery, made in the 1970s and confirmed through the 1980s, led to one of the most significant global environmental agreements in history, the Montreal Protocol of 1987, in which nations around the world agreed to phase out these damaging chemicals. It was a strange and sobering realization that the same technology keeping food safe in kitchens across the planet had been quietly thinning the atmosphere, protecting all life on Earth. Even after that crisis was largely addressed through newer refrigerants, a new irony emerged in recent decades, one tied directly to climate change. Refrigeration and air conditioning together now account for a significant share of global electricity consumption, and demand continues to rise every year as more households across developing nations gain access to refrigerators for the first time, creating a genuine tension between improving quality of life and managing the energy demands and emissions associated with keeping food, and increasingly entire buildings, cold. On top of this, modern refrigeration has paradoxically contributed to enormous levels of food waste in wealthy countries, since the sheer convenience of long-term storage has led many households to buy more food than they actually consume, letting a surprising percentage of it quietly expire in the back of the fridge before ever being eaten, an ironic modern echo of the exact problem refrigeration was originally invented to solve. Today, refrigerators sit in more than 99% of homes across developed countries, And the number continues climbing rapidly across the developing world as electrification expands into rural regions that never had reliable access to cold storage before. It has become one of those rare pieces of technology so deeply woven into daily existence that most people never stop to think about it at all. The same way nobody thinks twice about turning on a tap and expecting clean water to flow out. And yet, if you trace the entire sprawling architecture of the modern food system, the global economy of agriculture and trade, the rise of the supermarket, the shift in women's domestic labor, the decline of infant mortality, the design of modern cities, the strategic logistics of militaries and vaccines, and even international environmental treaties protecting the atmosphere itself, all of it eventually leads back to one quiet, unremarkable moment. It leads back to a single engineer named Fred W. Wolf, sitting in a workshop in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in the year 1913, tired of waiting for the iceman, tired of dripping water on his kitchen floor, simply trying to build a small machine that could keep his own food cold without needing anyone else's help. He was not thinking about supermarkets or global trade routes or the ozone layer or the future shape of cities. He was thinking about one small personal inconvenience in one small city on one particular afternoon more than a century ago. And from that single small gesture, from one man refusing to accept the daily hassle of melting ice, an entire world quietly reorganized itself around the simple, radical idea that cold could be made on demand in your own home whenever you needed it. Sometimes the smallest, most private frustrations turn out to be the exact hinge on which the whole future quietly swings.